Herzliya Conference. Special interviews, highlights, and live broadcasts on IDC Radio.
Welcome to the IDC International Radio on 106.2 FM. I'm here with Dr. Gary Samore, who's a former White House coordinator for arms control and weapons of mass destruction for President Obama, and is executive director for research at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. How are you?
Very good, thank you.
You've just finished a couple of panel discussions titled Iran's Domestic Power Struggle and the Regional Balance of Power, and another panel called The Day After a Deal with Iran, Regional and Global Implications. Now, the day after a deal with Iran sounds a little optimistic for me, but putting aside the fact, assuming a deal is reached, what are, in your opinion, the implications for Israel?
Well, it was clear from the panel that it's hard to predict how Iran will respond in the aftermath of an agreement. Some people feel that Iran may think a deal gives them a shield, gives them protection in order to increase their aggressive behavior in Syria or pressure against Bahrain and so forth, because the Iranians will calculate that the U.S. and the Europeans will be afraid of upsetting a deal by challenging Iran. Other experts argue that in the aftermath of a deal, Iran might be more restrained, because if the deal is in Iran's interest, they're getting sanctions relief, they wouldn't want to take actions that might jeopardize the deal. Of course, we don't know which of those two theories is correct. I hope we have a chance to test that proposition. But it is clear that we'll have to make clear to Iran that even if there is a nuclear deal, that doesn't mean the U.S. will shy away from challenging Iran, working with our allies in the region to deal with Iranian misbehavior in terms of support for Hezbollah or intervention in the Syrian civil war or efforts to destabilize Bahrain or Saudi.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there is anybody in the Western world who truly understands Iran, the Iranian people, the Iranian leadership? Is there anybody who knows what they're thinking, or is it all speculation?
Well, there are experts who've spent their careers studying and trying to understand. My personal view is that Iran's politics at the elite level is very murky and complicated. It's not a simple government in the sense that it's not ruled by a single person who basically has the ability to make decisions on his own. It's a very complicated structure. The supreme leader obviously has the most dominant voice, and he's the final person who has to approve. But beneath him, there's such a complicated set of shifting factions and different bureaucratic interests, as well as business and economic interests, that I don't think we really have a very good understanding, especially of the Supreme Leader's calculations. Mm-hmm. And that was clear in the panel discussion on the domestic politics of Iran. Some experts think the Supreme Leader realizes how dangerous the situation is for Iran, that the economic sanctions are potentially creating political instability, and that he has to make very significant concessions in order to get a nuclear deal. Other people, like myself, are more skeptical that the Supreme Leader really feels under such tremendous pressure to make a bargain. And that's why I'm doubtful that we're going to see an agreement anytime soon that meets the demands that P5+1 are making.
Do you believe that the current set of sanctions are sufficient to put pressure, or would more sanctions have been beneficial?
Well, as I said, I think it's unlikely that the current level of sanctions will produce the kind of nuclear concessions that we're looking for. And if at the end of the day this diplomatic process fails, then we will need to look at putting additional sanctions on Iran to increase the pressure and hope that that has the desired result.
Having worked with President Obama, how would you describe his administration's goals and priorities when it comes to resolving the Iranian nuclear issue? And do you believe they are, on a fundamental level, aligned with Israel's goals?
Yes, I do think they are, because both the U.S. and Israel, and for that matter, our European allies, we all have a very strong interest in preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons, because we all understand what a catastrophe that would be for peace and stability in the region and for our own, national security. Sometimes we have different views about tactics, about how to achieve that objective, but in terms of achieving the ultimate goal of stopping Iran from getting nuclear weapons, I think that's a very strong common interest.
Syria is currently in the process of dismantling its WMDs, albeit more slowly than it promised. Do you see this as a success for the West, or is this only a way to pat ourselves on the back and to, in a way, feel better about neglecting some responsibilities?
Well, I think it's been a success in the sense that we've been able to remove and to dispose of the vast majority of Syria's chemical weapons, some 95% of it. And I think we'll probably be able to get rid of additional materials, even though the deadlines have slipped. But I don't think we'll be able to assume that that's everything. I think there will continue to be questions about whether the Syrian government has hidden at least some small amounts of chemical weapons, perhaps for use against the opposition. And so it will be a long time before we'll be able to pat ourselves on the back and say that the job is completely done. But aside from the chemical weapons process itself, I mean, the dismantlement program, which has been, I think, overall successful, the broader policy towards Syria, I'm afraid, has been a significant failure. I mean, basically, the Western countries have not been willing to provide significant support for any of the Syrian opposition. I think that has both tended to strengthen, on one hand, the jihadi elements of the opposition. On the other hand, it's given Assad, with the support of the Iranians and the Russians, the ability to survive and even make progress in the civil war. And I think that's really damaged the reputation of the U.S. and the Western countries, that we really haven't been willing to do anything effective. On one hand, we've called for Assad to leave, but on the other hand, we really haven't done anything to try to make that happen.
Russia and the U.S. have been at odds over the past few years on a number of fundamental questions, including the response to Syria, and then, of course, recently the situation in Ukraine. Do you think that the freezing, in a way, of some of the relations between Russia and the United States will have an impact on the abilities of the world to stop Iran from achieving nuclear capabilities?
So far, the dispute between Washington and Moscow over Syria, civil war, and over Ukraine doesn't seem to have affected Russian behavior in the nuclear negotiations. In fact, I hear from my American colleagues that the Russians continue to play a very constructive role in those negotiations, and they've joined the U.S. in making very tough demands of Iran as a condition for an agreement. However, I'm afraid that the Iranians may calculate that if there's a big blow up in relations between Washington and Moscow over Ukraine, they'll be under much less pressure to make nuclear concessions. So my guess is that the Iranians may feel they're in a stronger bargaining position, even if the Russians haven't actually changed their behavior inside the bargaining room.
As you've said, there are a number of experts on the question. Nobody has the final answer. But if you were to give a prediction, what would you bet on for the talks between Iran and the P5+1?
Well, I think it's very unlikely that they'll reach an agreement, a comprehensive agreement, by the end of July, because the two sides are so far apart on the most important issues in the negotiations. From our standpoint in particular, what physical limits will be imposed on Iran's ability to produce a fissile nuclear material. But at the same time, I think there'll be a strong agreement to continue the process, so I expect there to be some kind of interim agreement, which could extend the current talks, maybe a partial agreement that has some additional steps forward. I do not think the diplomatic process will break down at the end of July, even though there's not likely to be a comprehensive agreement.
And finally, if the agreements break down, or if there is an interim agreement to continue until next year, but there is really no final agreement at the end of it, the talk of Israel attacking Iran has somewhat abated with the talks, but obviously it is still very much on the table and on the minds of Israeli politicians. Do you believe that were an Israeli attack to happen, that the U.S. would support it and follow suit?
It really depends on the conditions. I mean, President Obama has said that he will stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons, including using military force. And I believe that if the Iranians were to move toward the acquisition of nuclear weapons, for example, if they began to produce weapons-grade nuclear material, I think President Obama would be willing to use military threats and force to stop that from happening. In that case, of course, Israel wouldn't need to take any action. I mean, the U.S. is much more capable in terms of its military, the damage that it can actually cause to Iran than Israel is. Up to now, the U.S. has discouraged Israel from taking action, partly because the uncertain of the consequences, and partly because Washington thought that we had other alternatives available, and we hadn't yet reached the point where the use of military force was the only resort. But if the Iranians were to move toward nuclear weapons in an unmistakable way, and Israel felt compelled to act, then I think the U.S. would understand, why Israel was taking that action. But as I said, I think the U.S. is likely to act in those circumstances.
Dr. Gary Samore, thank you so much for speaking with us. You're listening to the IDC International Radio on 106.2 FM. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Herzliya Conference. Special interviews, highlights, and live broadcasts on IDC Radio.